you're watching this after dark, you need to hear what I'm about to say. Maybe you're lying in bed, scrolling through stories to keep the silence at bay, or maybe you're just curious about what really happens in the farthest corners of Alaska when the sun disappears for days at a time. Either way, I need you to listen, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another campfire tale. It's a warning, and it might just save your life. My name is Jack Mercer, and I'm the sheriff of a town most people can't find on a map. Out here, winter isn't just a season, it's a test. The cold will strip you to the bone, the wind will steal your breath, and the darkness is where the real danger waits. People think the worst thing that can happen is getting lost in a blizzard or running out of fuel on a frozen road. They're wrong. The cold is only the beginning. There are things in Alaska older than any of us. Things that remember when this land was nothing but ice and silence. We call them the old ones, but most folks don't talk about them at all. Not unless they have to. Not unless the lights go out and the rules come into play. Because out here we have rules that aren't written in any police manual. Rules that don't make sense until you've seen what I've seen. Never leave a window uncovered after sunset. Never answer a knock at your door after midnight, no matter how familiar the voice sounds. Never, ever let the fire die before dawn. These aren't superstitions. They're surviving. I used to think they were just stories, warnings to keep kids from wandering off or to explain away the things we couldn't understand. But then the power went out, and I learned the hard way that the rules are all that stand between us and the things that hunt when the lights go out. So if you're watching this, remember, curiosity is dangerous in the dark. And in Alaska, the dark is always hungry. I wasn't always the sheriff. I grew up here, in a town where the snowdrifts are taller than most men and the northern lights paint the sky in colors you can't describe to anyone who hasn't seen them. My father was a trapper, my mother a nurse at the clinic, and I was the kid who always wanted to leave. I dreamed of cities with streetlights that never went out, of places where winter was just a word and not a sentence. I left for college in Anchorage, then joined the state police, thinking I'd never look back. But Alaska has a way of calling you home, especially when you think you've outrun your past. I came back after my father died. The official story was a heart attack, but anyone who knew him would tell you he was too stubborn to let his heart give out. My mother said he'd been different that last winter, jumpy, always checking the windows, never letting the fire burn low. He'd started carrying a pouch of salt in his pocket, muttering prayers in a language I barely remembered. I thought it was just age, or maybe the loneliness that comes with too many dark nights. I didn't understand. Not then. When the town council asked me to take over as sheriff, I hesitated. I'd spent years learning how to handle drunks, thieves, and the occasional bear that wandered too close to the school. I knew how to read a crime scene, how to talk someone down, how to keep my head when things got ugly. But nothing in the academy prepared me for the kind of calls I'd get here. Calls about voices in the wind, about shadows that moved against the snow, about people who vanished without a trace when the nights grew longest. The elders tried to warn me. They told me the land remembers, that there are places you don't go after dark, that some things can't be explained by logic or law. I listened, but I didn't really hear them. I thought I could bring order, that I could protect people with a badge and a gun and a radio. But the first time I found a set of footprints that started as boots and ended as something else, something with claws, I realized I was out of my depth. My connection to this place runs deeper than I ever wanted to admit. My family's been here for generations, and the land doesn't let go easily. The people here are tough, proud, and they know things I'm still learning to believe. I joined the force to keep them safe, but I'm starting to understand that safety means something different in Alaska. Out here, you don't just enforce the law, you remember the old ways, you respect the rules, and you pray the lights stay on. My first week as sheriff was a blur of paperwork, introductions, and the kind of small-town politics I'd forgotten existed. The station was a squat building with a wood stove that never seemed to keep the cold out, a radio that crackled more than it spoke, and a bulletin board covered in faded flyers for lost dogs and ice fishing tournaments. My deputies were a mix of old hands and young blood, people who'd grown up here, people who'd come north for a fresh start, and people who, like me, thought they could make a difference. On my second day, Deputy Annie brought me a laminated sheet. "You'll want to keep this handy," she said, her voice low. I glanced at it, expecting a list of radio codes or emergency contacts. Instead, I found a set of rules, written in blocky handwriting and decorated with smudges of what looked like ash. Never leave a window uncovered after sunset. Don't answer a knock at your door after midnight. Keep a line of salt across every threshold. If you hear your name whispered outside, don't respond. Never let the fire die before dawn. If you see lights moving in the woods, look away. Don't whistle after dark. I raised an eyebrow. Is this a joke? Annie shook her head. You'll see. I tucked the sheet into my desk drawer, telling myself it was just another local quirk, like the way people here still left food out for the ravens or painted blue circles on their sheds to keep away bad luck. But the strangeness started almost immediately. The first call came from Old Man Petrov, who lived alone at the edge of town. He reported someone knocking on his door at 2 in the morning, calling his name in a voice that sounded like his late wife. When I arrived, he was pale and shaking, clutching a shotgun and refusing to let me inside until I recited a prayer he'd taught me as a kid. I chalked it up to loneliness and the tricks the mind plays in the dark. The next day, a family's sled dogs were found dead, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle in the snow. No tracks led to or from the scene, and the only mark was a line of salt, broken in one spot. The father swore he'd heard whistling outside the night before, but when he looked, there was nothing but darkness. I started to notice other things, too. Windows were covered with heavy blankets, even in homes that barely had enough heat. Children who refused to go outside after sunset, no matter how much their parents coaxed. Stories whispered in the diner about the old ones, who came when the lights went out, about people who vanished without a trace, about footprints that changed shape halfway across a frozen pond. I wanted to believe it was just superstition, the kind of stories people tell to make sense of the unknown. But every time I tried to dismiss it, something else would happen. A radio that picked up voices speaking in a language I didn't know. A shadow that moved against the snow when nothing should have been there. A feeling of being watched that never quite went away. I kept the rules close, reading them every night before I locked up the station. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it couldn't hurt to follow a few old traditions. But deep down, I felt the first stirrings of fear, the sense that I was standing on the edge of something vast and ancient, something that didn't care about my badge or my training, something that was waiting for the lights to go out. It was the kind of night that makes you question why anyone would choose to live this far north. The wind howled against the station windows, rattling the glass in their frames, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the diesel in the trucks was threatening to freeze. I was finishing up paperwork when the call came in. A frantic voice on the other end, barely coherent, begging for help. It was Deputy Mark, one of the newer hires, a city kid from Juneau who still wore sneakers in the snow and laughed at the old stories. "Sheriff, I need backup. I'm at Miller Place. Something's wrong. I think someone's out here." The line went dead, replaced by a burst of static and what sounded like distant, echoing laughter. I grabbed my coat, radioed Annie, and headed out into the night. The Miller house sat on the edge of the woods, its windows glowing with the warm light of a wood stove. I found Mark on the porch, pale and shivering, his flashlight clutched in white-knuckled hands. "What happened?" I asked, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. He shook his head, eyes wide. "I heard knocking. I figured it was just one of the Millers. But when I opened the door, there was nobody there. Then I heard my name outside, in the trees. I thought maybe it was a prank, so I went to check. I whistled, just once. I don't know why. It was stupid. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I remembered the rule. Don't whistle after dark. We searched the yard together, but the snow was untouched except for a single set of footprints, marks, leading from the porch to the edge of the woods and back. No sign of anyone else. No animal tracks. Nothing. But the air felt wrong, heavy and electric, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Inside, the Millers were huddled in the living room, the curtains drawn tight. Mrs. Miller clutched a Bible, her lips moving in silent prayer. "We heard it too," she whispered. "The whistling, and then something scratching at the windows. We didn't look. We know better." Mark tried to laugh it off, but his voice shook. "It was probably just the wind, right?" I wanted to agree, to tell him he was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That by breaking the rule, he'd invited something in. That night, the power went out across half the town. Generators failed, and the darkness pressed in, thick and absolute. People reported seeing shapes moving in the snow, hearing voices that sounded like lost loved ones, feeling cold fingers brush against their skin. The next morning, we found strange marks carved into the ice outside the Miller house. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that made my skin crawl. Mark didn't come back to work for 3 days. When he did, he was quieter, jumpier, always glancing over his shoulder. He started carrying salt in his pockets, and he never whistled again. I realized then that the rules weren't just old wives' tales. They were warnings passed down for a reason. And now something was awake, watching, waiting for the next mistake. The days that followed felt like living in a pressure cooker. The cold deepened, the sun barely crept above the horizon, and the darkness seemed to settle in for good. Reports started coming in faster than we could handle. Livestock found dead with no tracks in the snow. Children waking up screaming about faces at their windows. Radios picking up static that sometimes sounded like voices whispering names. People who'd always laughed at the old stories now kept their curtains drawn and their porch lights burning all night, even when the power grid flickered and failed. I tried to keep order, to reassure everyone that we were on top of things. But the truth was, I was just as rattled as they were. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those marks in the ice and heard whistling echoing through the trees. I started carrying the rules in my pocket, running my thumb over the words like a talisman. I checked the windows twice before bed, kept a line of salt at every door, and made sure the fire never burned down to embers. One evening, as I was locking up the station, I found old Mrs. Koenig waiting for me outside. She was bundled in layers of wool, her face lined with years and wisdom. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You need to listen, Jack. The old ones are restless. They come when the dark is longest, when people forget the rules. You think you can fight them with guns and radios, but you can't. You have to remember what your father taught you." I tried to brush her off, but she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You're the sheriff now. That means you're responsible for all of us. If you don't respect the old ways, you'll lose more than just your pride. You'll lose people." Her words stuck with me. That night, I called my mother. She sounded tired, her voice thin over the crackling line. "Your father always said the land remembers, Jack. He believed in the rules even when you didn't. Don't let your stubbornness get someone hurt." The next morning, we found Deputy Annie's truck abandoned on the road to the old cannery. The engine was still running, headlights cutting through the fog, but Annie was gone. Her radio sat on the seat, hissing with static. In the snow beside the truck, we found a perfect circle of footprints, boots that turned to bare feet, then to something else entirely. The tracks led into the woods and vanished. The town gathered that night in the church basement, everyone talking at once, fear thick in the air. I stood in front of them, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "We're doing everything we can," I said, "but we need to stick together. Follow the rules. Don't go out after dark. Don't answer the door if you hear your name. Keep your fires burning." The elders nodded, but I saw the doubt in the eyes of the younger folks, the ones who'd never believed in anything they couldn't see. I understood their fear. I felt it too, but I also knew that something ancient was moving in the dark, and if we didn't respect the warnings, we'd all pay the price. I spent the next few days chasing shadows, trying to make sense of what was happening to my town. I started with Annie's disappearance, retracing her last known steps. The road to the old cannery was lined with spruce and birch, their branches heavy with snow, muffling every sound. I found nothing but the circle of footprints, the strange transition from boots to bare feet to clawed impressions that defied explanation. I took photos, measured the prints, and sent them to the state lab, but I already knew what they'd say: no match, no logical answer. I interviewed the Millers again, hoping for some detail I'd missed. Mrs. Miller clung to her Bible, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. "It's not safe, Sheriff. Not when the dark is this deep. My grandmother used to say the old ones walk when the sun is asleep." I never believed her, but now... She trailed off, shivering despite the heat. I tried to reassure her, but my words felt hollow. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, some drifter, a wild animal, maybe even a prank gone wrong. But the evidence kept piling up against reason. The dogs were found in a perfect circle, the marks in the ice, the voices on the radio that sometimes whispered my name in a tone that sounded like my father's. I went through the old case files looking for patterns. There were stories going back decades, people vanishing during the long nights, strange lights moving through the woods, entire families packing up and leaving without a word. My father's handwriting appeared in the margins of some reports, notes about salt, about never letting the fire die, about the rules. I remembered how he'd always double-check the locks, how he'd mutter prayers in the old language when the wind howled. I thought it was just a habit, but now I wondered what he'd seen that made him so careful. I called the state police, hoping for backup, but they were snowed in 2 towns over. "Probably just a bear," the dispatcher said, her voice dismissive. "Or someone playing games. Happens every winter." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on our own. That night, I sat by the fire, the rules spread out on the table in front of me. I read them over and over, searching for loopholes, for some way to outthink whatever was stalking us. I was trained to trust evidence, to follow facts, but the facts were turning against me. Every logical path led to a dead end. Every rational explanation crumbled under the weight of what I'd seen. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if the darkness was getting to me, if I was seeing patterns where none existed. But then the radio crackled to life, and I heard Annie's voice, faint and distorted, calling my name from somewhere out in the woods. "Jack, help me. It's so cold." The signal faded, replaced by static and a low, guttural growl. I stared at the radio, heart pounding, torn between the urge to rush out into the night and the knowledge that breaking the rules could cost me everything. Logic told me it was impossible, but belief was starting to feel like the only thing that might keep us alive. The night Annie's voice came through the radio, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The fear in her words, the way the static seemed to pulse with something alive, left me no choice. I gathered my gear, flashlight, shotgun, extra shells, a pouch of salt, and the rules folded in my pocket. I left a note on my desk. "If I'm not back by dawn, follow the rules. Don't come looking." The wind was howling as I stepped outside, the cold biting through my coat, the sky a black void above the snow. I drove as far as I could toward the old cannery, headlights barely cutting through the swirling drifts. The road ended in a wall of snow, so I continued on foot, boots crunching in the silence. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but Annie's voice echoed in my mind, pleading for help. I kept the salt in my fist, the shotgun slung over my shoulder, and recited the rules under my breath like a prayer. The woods closed in around me, branches creaking in the wind. I saw lights flickering between the trees, blue and green, like the northern lights had come down to earth. I remembered the rule. If you see lights moving in the woods, look away. I forced myself to stare at the ground, heart hammering, but curiosity gnawed at me. I glanced up, just for a second, and saw shapes moving in the glow, tall, thin figures with eyes that reflected the light like ice. They watched me, silent and patient, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. I pressed on, following the faint sound of Annie's voice, now barely more than a whisper. The snow grew deeper, the cold more intense, and I felt the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating. I reached a clearing where the trees bent away from the center, as if something had forced them back. In the middle stood Annie, or what looked like her, shivering in the snow, her eyes wide and empty. "Annie," I called, but she didn't respond. I stepped closer, salt ready, shotgun raised. That's when I saw the footprints around her, bare feet, then claws circling, closing in. I remembered the rule. Don't answer a knock at your door after midnight, no matter how familiar the voice. I hesitated, doubt gnawing at me. Was this really Annie, or something wearing her face? She spoke, her voice wrong, layered with something ancient. "Jack, it's so cold. Please, help me." I took a step back, heart pounding. The figures in the trees moved closer, their eyes glowing brighter. I scattered salt in a circle around myself, reciting the old prayer my father used to say. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing tighter, and the figures hissed, recoiling from the salt. Annie, or the thing that looked like her, lunged at the edge of the circle, her face twisting into something inhuman, mouth stretching wide, eyes black as the void. I fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees, but the thing barely flinched. It clawed at the salt, shrieking in a voice that was both Annie's and not. The old ones closed in, their forms shifting and flickering in the unnatural light. I felt the rules burning in my pocket, the words searing into my mind. Never let the fire die before dawn. I fumbled for my lighter, set a branch ablaze and held it high. The flames cast wild shadows, and the creatures shrank back, hissing and wailing. I shouted the rules into the night, daring the darkness to break them. The wind howled, the snow swirled, and the old ones retreated, melting into the trees. The thing that wore Annie's face dissolved into mist, leaving only her badge in the snow. I stood alone in the clearing, breath ragged, the fire guttering in my hand. I'd faced the unknown, tested the rules, and survived. Barely. But I knew this was only the beginning. The old ones had been challenged, not defeated, and the darkness would remember my defiance. I stumbled back through the woods, the fire in my hand burning low, the salt pouch nearly empty. My mind raced with everything I'd seen, the shifting shapes, the way Annie's voice had twisted into something monstrous, the old ones circling just beyond the reach of the flame. I knew I couldn't go back to town and pretend nothing had happened. The rules weren't just warnings. They were the only thing keeping us alive. And now, with the old ones stirred and the darkness thickening, I had to do more than just survive. I had to protect everyone else. I reached the edge of the woods and saw the town below, lights flickering in the windows, smoke rising from chimneys. But even from a distance, I could sense the fear. The air felt charged, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I hurried to the station, my boots crunching on the ice, and found Annie's badge still clutched in my hand. I set it on my desk, a silent promise that I wouldn't let her fate be in vain. I called a meeting at the church, the only place big enough to hold everyone. The townsfolk gathered, faces pale and drawn, eyes darting to the windows. I stood before them, the rules in one hand, my father's old hunting knife in the other. "We can't keep pretending this is just a run of bad luck," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "You all know the stories. You know the rules. Tonight we follow them to the letter. No exceptions." Old Mrs. Koenig nodded, her eyes shining with something like pride. "It's time for the ritual," she said. "The one our grandparents used when the darkness grew too strong." She handed me a bundle wrapped in sealskin, sage, salt, a small carved figure, and a strip of red cloth. "You'll need these." I divided the townsfolk into groups, assigning each a task. Some would keep the fires burning in every home, feeding them with sage and cedar. Others would lay lines of salt across every threshold, every window, every door. The elders gathered in the church, chanting prayers in the old language, their voices rising and falling like the wind. I moved from house to house, checking the preparations, repeating the rules to anyone who would listen. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped even further, the darkness pressing in so thick it felt like a living thing. The wind carried voices, some familiar, some not, calling out from the woods, begging to be let in. I reminded everyone, don't answer, don't look, don't break the circle. At the station, I prepared for the final part of the ritual. I drew a circle of salt around my desk, placed the carved figure in the center, and wrapped the red cloth around my wrist. I lit a fire in the old wood stove, feeding it with sage and cedar, the smoke curling up to the ceiling. I recited the prayer my father had taught me, the words awkward on my tongue but powerful all the same. The radio crackled to life, voices whispering my name, promising warmth, safety, the return of lost loved ones. I ignored them, focusing on the fire, the salt, the steady rhythm of the prayer. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows, and I saw shadows moving outside, tall, thin shapes with eyes like shards of ice. Suddenly, the fire sputtered, threatening to die. I grabbed more wood, feeding the flames, chanting louder. The shadows pressed against the glass, their faces shifting and changing, becoming people I'd lost. My father, Annie, even myself. They begged to be let in, their voices sweet and familiar. I closed my eyes, clutching the red cloth, and remembered the rule. If you hear your name whispered outside, don't respond. The pressure built, the darkness swirling, the fire flickering lower and lower. I reached for the salt, scattering it into the flames, the smoke turning thick and acrid. The shadows screamed, recoiling from the light, their forms dissolving into mist. I kept chanting, louder and louder, until my voice was raw, the words tumbling out in a desperate plea. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pressure eased. The fire roared back to life, the shadows vanished, and the wind died down to a whisper. I opened my eyes to find the room empty, the radio silent, the salt circle unbroken. I stepped outside, the cold biting but clean, the sky beginning to lighten at the horizon. The town was quiet, the fires still burning, the lines of salt untouched. People emerged from their homes, blinking in the pale dawn, relief and exhaustion etched on every face. We had survived the night. The rules had held. The ritual had worked, not because of any one person, but because we'd faced the darkness together, honoring the old ways and trusting in each other. I knew the old ones would return, that the darkness would always be waiting. But for now, we were safe. And I was no longer just a sheriff. I was a guardian of the rules, a keeper of the light, and a believer in the power of tradition and community. When the sun finally crested the mountains, it felt like the whole town exhaled at once. The darkness retreated, leaving behind a silence that was almost sacred. People emerged from their homes, blinking in the pale light, hugging each other, some weeping openly. The fires had burned all night, the salt lines remained unbroken, and for the first time in days, there were no new reports of missing livestock, no strange marks in the snow, no voices in the wind. We had made it through, but not without scars. Annie was still gone. Her badge sat on my desk, a reminder of the price we'd paid. Some families had lost pets, others had lost sleep, and all of us had lost a little more of our innocence. The old stories weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings, hard-earned and paid for in fear and grief. I walked the streets that morning, checking on neighbors, accepting quiet thanks and silent nods. The elders met my eyes with a new respect, and even the skeptics seemed changed, their bravado tempered by what they'd witnessed. I thought about my father, about the rules he'd lived by and the prayers he'd whispered when he thought no one was listening. I understood now why he'd been so careful, why he'd carried salt and kept the fire burning. I understood the weight of responsibility that came with this land, this job, this community. I'd come back to Alaska thinking I could bring order, that I could protect people with training and logic. But I'd learned that some threats can't be reasoned with, that some dangers are older than any law. We survived because we remembered the old ways, because we stood together, because we respected the rules. The cost was real, but so was the lesson. As I watched the sun rise over the snow, I promised myself I'd never forget. The darkness would come again, and when it did, I'd be ready. Not just as a sheriff, but as a guardian of the stories, the rules, and the fragile line between our world and the one that waits in the cold. The days grew longer, and the town slowly returned to its routines, but something fundamental had shifted. People kept their windows covered at night, salt became a staple in every home, and the old prayers were spoken more often, even by those who once scoffed at them. I kept Annie's badge in my pocket, a silent promise that I'd never let my guard down again. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the woods or hear a whisper on the wind that sounded almost familiar. The elders said the old ones never truly leave. They just wait, patient as the ice, for the next long night. I started writing down everything I'd learned, adding to the rules, hoping that when the darkness returned, we'd be ready. But I know better than to think we're safe forever. In Alaska, the dark is always hungry, and the old ones are always listening. The rules kept us alive this time, but the winter will come again, and with it, the things that hunt when the lights go out. If you ever find yourself here, remember, the rules are all that stand between you and the cold.